Welcome to Starbound. My name is Chikondi and I'll be your narrator today. But before we get into today's story, please quickly check below to see if you've subscribed to the channel. It's 100% free, and it just helps make sure that our videos pop up in your feed more often. The Grand Council chamber fell silent as the delegation from Earth concluded their presentation. Ambassador Zrixtal adjusted his ceremonial robes, watching the small group of humans standing at the center of the vast circular hall. Their composure was notable. Most species showed at least some nervousness when addressing the assembled representatives of galactic civilization for the first time. Representative Kexnar rose from his hovering council seat, towering over the human delegation.
Let us be certain we understand correctly. Your species has mastered faster-than-light travel. Yet, in all your history, you never established a single permanent colony beyond your homeworld?
That is correct, the lead human diplomat responded evenly. Her name was Yuria Verone, and something in her steady gaze made Zixtal straighten in his seat. She stood with perfect poise, hands clasped behind her back, expression neutral yet attentive.
Not even on your own moon?
Another counselor called out.
Or the habitable zones of your neighboring planets?
We maintained research outposts and industrial operations throughout our solar system,
Yuria explained, her tone unchanged.
But no, we did not establish permanent civilian colonies.
Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Counselor Dex of the Talari leaned forward, his gray stone-like features creasing.
And you expect us to take your species seriously? To grant you equal standing among civilizations that have spread across dozens of worlds?
We expect nothing,
Yuria replied.
We are here to establish diplomatic relations, nothing more.
Zrixtal found himself studying her more carefully. Most species would be desperately trying to prove themselves worthy by now. These humans seemed almost unconcerned by the Council's obvious disdain.
Perhaps,
Kexnar suggested, his lips curling slightly,
your species simply lacks the capability for proper expansion. Not all races are suited for the challenges of multi-planetary civilization.
The human delegation remained unmoved. Yuria simply inclined her head and said,
We would be happy to host a diplomatic mission on Earth. The Council can evaluate our capabilities firsthand.
An excellent suggestion,
Zrixtal found himself saying. The steady rhythm of his bioluminescent patches quickened slightly as his fellow counselors turned to look at him.
As the newest species to achieve faster-than-light travel, humanity must be properly assessed.
And we would welcome such an assessment,
Yuria replied.
Though I should note that Earth may not match your expectations.
I will personally lead the diplomatic mission,
Zrixtal declared, rising to his full height.
We shall see exactly what your species has achieved with its limited scope.
We look forward to hosting you, Ambassador,
Yuria said with a small bow.
I think you'll find that Earth has its own unique approach to civilization.
As the human delegation withdrew from the chamber, the council chambers filled once again with dismissive commentary. Zrixtal began mental preparations for what would surely be a brief and unremarkable diplomatic assignment. Yet he couldn't quite dismiss the composed confidence he'd seen in those humans. Whatever it is they have, they are certain of themselves in it.
Entering Sol system now, Ambassador,
the pilot announced as their ship decelerated from FTL. Zrixtal nodded absently, reviewing diplomatic protocols on his datapad. The ship's sensors began their standard sweep of the system.
Ambassador,
the pilot's voice carried an odd note.
You should see this.
Zrixtal looked up, ready to dismiss whatever primitive oddity had caught the pilot's attention. But the readings on the main display gave him pause.
That can't be correct. Run the scan again.
Already did, sir. 3 times. The pilot adjusted several controls. The electromagnetic radiation density is... I've never seen anything like it. It's orders of magnitude beyond standard cosmic background. Architect Venna, a Talari ambassador who had heard of the Coruscant mission and invited herself along as usual, moved to examine the readings herself with her stone-like Talari features arranged in clear skepticism.
Perhaps their star is unusually active?
No, the pilot shook his head. These aren't solar emissions. They're artificial. Communications, power transfers, data streams. So much traffic, the sensors can barely distinguish individual signals.
Zrixtal frowned.
From their single planet?
From their entire system.
Venna corrected, studying the data.
The density increases as we approach the inner planets, but even out here...
She trailed off, making notations on her own pad. As they proceeded deeper into the system, the sensor readings only grew more unusual. Zrixtal found himself spending more time watching the displays than reviewing his protocols. Mars showed significant industrial activity. Venus hosted massive energy collection arrays. The asteroid belt teemed with automated mining operations.
Signal from Earth Control, the communications officer announced. They're transmitting approach vectors and flight protocol.
Zrixtal moved to respond, but found himself momentarily speechless as Earth came into visual range. He had expected to see a crowded, polluted world. Instead, massive orbital rings encircled the planet at different inclinations, their surfaces dotted with ports, factories, and habitat sections. Space elevators, not 1 or 2, but dozens, stretched from the surface up to geosynchronous orbit, their cables glowing with constant streams of cargo pods and transport cars. And the planet itself, the night side was approaching, and Zrixtal watched in growing amazement as it came into view. The continents blazed with light, not in sparse clusters, but in vast sweeping patterns that covered entire regions. Massive structures rose through the atmosphere, their peaks lost in the clouds. Rivers of aerial traffic wove between them, so dense they formed visible lanes of light.
Preparing for orbital insertion, the pilot announced, his voice slightly strained. Earth Control is directing us to Embassy Approach Lane 7.
7?
Venna asked.
How many approaches are there?
According to these protocols, several hundred. We're being assigned to the diplomatic sector.
Zrixtal finally found his voice.
How many ships do they process daily to need so many dedicated lanes?
The traffic control data suggests...
The pilot paused, double-checking his readings.
Millions! Per day!
A new voice came over the comm system. Measured, professional, feminine.
Diplomatic Vessel Stellar Dawn, this is Chief Diplomatic Officer Verone. Welcome to Earth. Please maintain your assigned approach vector. We're experiencing heavy traffic in the diplomatic sector today.
Zrixtal recognized her voice from the council meeting. He opened a response channel, working to keep his tone appropriately diplomatic.
Thank you, Officer Verone.
He hesitated, watching a massive cargo vessel pass below them, easily dwarfing their diplomatic ship.
We look forward to learning more about your world.
I'm sure you do, Ambassador,
she replied, and he could have sworn he heard a smile in her voice.
Please proceed to your designated embassy site. The building has been prepared according to Council specifications, though with necessary adjustments as befit the existing infrastructure.
The ship began its descent through the layers of orbital infrastructure. Zrixtal found himself remembering Verone's words from the council chamber. Earth may not match your expectations. He had a growing suspicion that might prove to be quite an understatement. The descent through Earth's layers of aerial traffic left even the ship's experienced pilot visibly tense. Vessels of every conceivable size and configuration filled the designated lanes. Massive cargo haulers, sleek passenger transports, maintenance craft tending to the towering arcologies that pierced the clouds. Their own diplomatic vessel seemed almost lost amid the endless stream of traffic. "Approaching Embassy District 7, the pilot announced, his hands moving carefully across the controls. "Final descent in 3 minutes." A maintenance drone nearly the size of their ship passed close by, tending to the surface of a structure that stretched further than Zrixtal could see in either direction. The sheer scale of human construction challenged his understanding of engineering limitations.
Interesting.
Architect Venna muttered, recording everything with her datapad.
Their construction techniques shouldn't be possible with standard materials. What in the galaxy are these things made of?
Diplomatic vessel Stellar Dawn. Uria's voice came through the comms again.
Your embassy site is the building on your port side. Docking controls are being transferred to local systems.
The ship's pilot surrendered control as their vessel was smoothly guided into a docking bay larger than most Coruscant spacecraft hangars. Through the viewports, Zrixtal could see other diplomatic ships. Some he recognized from Council worlds, others completely foreign.
"How many diplomatic missions are you hosting?"
he asked through the shuttle's comms terminal, unable to keep the question to himself.
Yours is the 47th this week,
Uria replied.
Word spreads quickly. The Council's mockery of our single-planet status seems to have sparked considerable curiosity.
Several crew members shifted uncomfortably at the diplomatic officer's direct reference to the Council's condescension. Zrixtal noted that her tone remained purely professional, neither accusatory nor defensive. The ship settled into its berth with a gentle thrum. Uria stood waiting as they disembarked, her formal attire understated yet immaculate. She offered a shallow bow.
Welcome to Embassy District 7. I trust your approach was comfortable? The traffic density is remarkable,
Venna said before Zrixtal could respond.
How do you manage such volume without constant collisions? Automated systems handling the routine flights, with human operators monitoring for exceptions,
Uria explained.
Though I'm sure you'll have many more questions once you see the embassy itself.
She gestured toward a nearby transport pod. As they boarded, Zrixtal realized the small vehicle could comfortably seat 20 passengers. The pod detached and began moving through a transparent tube that offered dizzying views of the surrounding architecture.
Your building codes must be extraordinarily complex,
Venna commented, watching maintenance crews walking directly on the outside of nearby structures, held in place by some invisible force.
They are,
Uria agreed.
Though complexity becomes necessary when you build on this scale. We found early on that traditional zoning and construction approaches simply couldn't handle the demands of vertical expansion.
The pod accelerated smoothly, weaving between towers that made the Council's greatest architectural achievements seem modest by comparison. Zrixtal found his eyes drawn to the endless streams of traffic moving in all directions. Not just aerial vehicles, but ground transport levels and pedestrian walkways spanning between buildings.
Here we are,
Uria announced as the pod slowed.
Your designated embassy site.
Zrixtal turned to look and felt his body go still. The structure before them rose at least a kilometer into the air, its sweeping architecture reminiscent of Coruscant design, but on a scale his people had never attempted. The entrance alone could have housed most planetary embassies he'd visited.
"This is for us?"
he managed.
Of course.
Uria stepped out of the pod.
We built it to Coruscant specifications, accounting for your cultural preferences for open spaces and natural lighting. Though we did have to adjust some of the proportions to match local building codes.
Architect Venna moved closer to the building's surface, running her hand along the material.
What is this made of? The structural properties. We can arrange a technical briefing on our construction methods, Uriah offered. But first, let me show you to your offices. I believe you'll find the accommodation suitable.
As they followed her into the embassy, Zrixtal found himself re-evaluating every assumption he'd made about humanity. Each new detail forced him to expand his understanding of what their single-planet species had achieved. The next hours passed in a blur of tours and introductions. Their hosts had prepared everything according to Coruscant customs, yet every room and facility demonstrated engineering far beyond what his people considered possible. Even the simple act of waste recycling involved systems that put their best environmental technology to shame. "Mind the walkway," Administrator Jack Jones cautioned as their group stepped onto what appeared to be solid ground. The surface shifted slightly beneath their feet, absorbing and redistributing their weight. The paths adapt to traffic patterns, helps prevent congestion. Zrixtal watched pedestrians flowing around them in steady streams. They walked on multiple levels, not just the ground, but elevated paths that wound between buildings and through them. The surfaces weren't uniform either. Some people moved faster on accelerated strips, while others strolled casually through garden-lined passages. "Each district contains every essential function," Jack explained, his scars catching the light as he gestured to different levels. "Medical facilities, education centers, entertainment, manufacturing, agriculture, everything a community needs, just arranged vertically instead of spread across the ground."
But how do you coordinate between levels?
Venna asked, studying a massive support column that somehow contained a fully functional hydroponics farm within its transparent sections. "Think of it like a living organism," Jack said. "Each level handles specific functions, but they're all connected through infrastructure and transport systems. The residential areas up top are like the skin. Agriculture and manufacturing in the middle levels are like organs, and underneath," he grinned, "well, that's where it gets interesting." They passed through a market sector where vendors sold goods from stalls built right into the walls. The variety was staggering. Fresh produce grown within the district itself, manufactured goods from local fabrication centers, even artisanal crafts made by residents.
"Your people live comfortably with such density?"
Zrixtal asked, noting how the crowds moved with practiced ease through what his species would consider impossibly cramped spaces. "Comfortable is relative," Jack replied. "We learn to build communities that balance private space with public amenities. Each residential unit has everything a person needs, but the shared spaces are what make it work." He pointed to a nearby park area where children played on structures that seemed to defy gravity. "People need green spaces, places to gather, room to move. We just had to figure out how to provide that vertically." They entered a transport hub where streams of people moved between different transit systems, from individual pods to mass transit vehicles that carried hundreds. The flow of traffic seemed chaotic at first glance, but Zrixtal began to see the patterns. Every movement was coordinated, every system working with and around the others. "The real challenge isn't building the infrastructure," Jack continued as they boarded a viewing platform. "It's maintaining it. That's why most of our workforce focuses on systems management and maintenance. Everything has to work together." The platform rose through several levels, giving them a cross-sectional view of the city's layers. Each level revealed new complexity: power distribution networks, waste recycling systems, automated delivery mechanisms. By normal standards, it shouldn't work. Structures should collapse. Specific networks should choke while others remained underutilized. The cost of recycling waste should far outweigh the benefits of doing so.
How many people live in this district?
Venna asked, making rapid notes on her pad.
"District 7 houses about 60 million,
Jack answered.
pretty average for a residential zone of this size."
Zrixtal nearly stumbled.
60 million? In one district?
Sure, though it's really more like 60 connected cities stacked on top of each other. Each level has its own local governance, but they all work together under district administration. Jack led them onto an observation deck overlooking a vast indoor space where multiple levels converged. This is one of our community hubs. People from different levels come here to socialize, trade, and attend events. The space buzzed with activity. Restaurants and shops lined multiple levels. Entertainment venues hosted everything from musical performances to technological demonstrations. Gardens and water features provided natural beauty among the architectural marvels.
Most impressive,
Zrixtal admitted, watching the interplay of systems and people.
though I imagine the energy requirements must be staggering.
That's why we started with power infrastructure, Jack explained. Geothermal, fusion, solar. We needed reliable, clean energy before we could build vertically. Once we solved that, the rest was just a matter of scale.
Just a matter of scale.
Venna repeated quietly, shaking her head.
You make it sound so simple.
The principles are simple, Jack said. It's the execution that took generations. Every system had to be tested, refined, and meshed with the others. We didn't have the time to wait for perfect systems, so we focused on backwards compatibility, modularity, and making sure everything was upgradable. It's all organic, in a way. They continued through residential areas where homes were built into the walls themselves, each with its own garden space and access to community amenities. The density was remarkable, yet it didn't feel overcrowded. Every space served multiple functions. Every system supported multiple needs. One of the lesser ambassadors besides Zrixtal piped up.
How many people live on this world? I've seen more transports today than there are people on my home planet.
Jack's eyes rolled up slightly as he seemed to rifle through his own memory. Last I remembered, the figure was somewhere around 500 billion? The entire delegation froze mid-stride, staring in shock at the figure Jack just dropped as if it were a casual mention of tomorrow's weather. The lesser ambassador stuttered.
500 billion? That is more people than the entire Coruscant Empire. Thrice over.
Zrixtal, maintaining his diplomatic composure despite internally screaming over the revelation, looked around again with new eyes. 500 billion. Enough people to make any city on any world feel like a choking tide of people. To overcrowd any known infrastructure and cause mass death on incomprehensible scales. And here they were, standing in a bustling residential park where they watched a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a percent of that number walk, talk, and play as casually as a quaint suburb. And even then, there was still enough here to feel like the Talari's industrial capital of 10 billion. I think it's a good idea we never colonized other planets, Jack commented as they watched an automated maintenance system repair a section of wall. We were too busy solving the challenges here. Why bother colonizing another world if we couldn't even manage this one? Now, the surface levels are impressive, Administrator Jones said as their transport pod descended through layers of infrastructure. But the real work happens underground. The pod's walls were transparent, offering views of massive engineering projects as they dropped deeper into Earth's crust. Vast chambers opened around them, filled with rumbling and humming machinery. These are the primary geothermal taps, Jack explained. They extract heat from the mantle and convert it directly to power. We used to worry about somehow draining the core of all its heat, but it turns out the heat comes directly from gravity, and off-world mining of the belts actually increased Earth's mass by enough to sustain our needs, in combination with solar, fusion, and fission, of course. The system extends through the entire crust, not just drawing energy, but actively managing tectonic stability. Architect Venner pressed closer to the wall, studying the machinery.
You've transformed your planet's entire crust into a habitable zone?
Had to. Jack gestured to a massive structure that resembled a mechanical tree, its roots extending deep into the rock. Early vertical cities taught us that you can't just build up, or even the slightest tectonic shift will topple it like a domino. So we learned to redirect seismic forces, channel heat, and even strengthen the crust itself. The pod passed through a chamber where robots the size of buildings maintained colossal machines. Energy arced between collection arrays in controlled patterns, feeding into distribution networks that vanished into the walls. Most of our industrial processes happen down here, Jack continued. Manufacturing, resource extraction, waste processing, anything that generates heat or requires significant power. The deeper layers act as heat sinks and power sources at the same time. Zrixtal watched a stream of raw materials flow through transparent pipes, transformed by processes he couldn't begin to understand.
Your people work in these conditions?
Some do, but most of the deep systems are automated. Jack tapped a control panel, bringing up a holographic display of the surrounding infrastructure. Maintenance crews monitor everything remotely and signal for human intervention when needed. They emerged into a vast cavern that stretched beyond visible limits. Platforms and structures filled the space, connected by a web of transport tubes and power conduits. The scale made the surface construction seem modest by comparison. This is one of our primary industrial zones, Jack said. Raw materials come in, finished products go out. Everything from construction components to consumer goods. The whole system is interconnected. Waste from one process becomes raw material for another. Their pod turned down a new tunnel, revealing a chamber filled with massive spherical structures. Water processing, Jack explained. Every drop gets recycled. The system handles everything from rain to wastewater, purifying it and returning it where needed.
Your people accept living above such dangerous processes?
Zrixtal asked. Jack shook his head. These aren't dangerous. They're necessary. The systems are redundant, self-repairing, and designed to fail safely if something goes wrong. Besides, would you rather have waste processing in your neighborhood or kilometers below it? The pod began ascending through different layers of infrastructure. Each level revealed new complexity. Power distribution networks, automated manufacturing centers, resource processing facilities. Every conceivable artifact of infrastructure needed for a city of a scale larger than any other in the galaxy, all condensed in this massive space. And it was just one such zone. The real challenge was standardization, Jack said as they watched raw materials being transformed into building components. Every system has to work with every other system, even ones that haven't been invented yet. We learned that lesson early. Trying to upgrade incompatible infrastructure is a nightmare. Vanna gestured to a massive machine assembling what looked like structural elements.
These systems must require constant maintenance. I noticed even above drones the size of shuttles. You said they are automated? But surely even the drones need repairs.
They maintain themselves mostly, Jack replied. The machines build and repair each other. Humans handle the creative work, designing improvements, solving new problems, figuring out better ways to streamline everything. We build, the bots maintain. Music drifted through multiple levels of the auditorium they'd moved to for the tour of the second day. The performers were arranged in a three-dimensional array that turned the very architecture into their instrument. Audiences gathered on different floors, each perspective offering a unique experience of the composition. Vertical space shapes everything we do, Jack explained as they watched from a private observation deck. Art, music, sports, they all evolved to use depth as well as width. Below them, dancers moved between levels in choreographed patterns, using grav-assisted cables to create flowing movements through the open space. The integration of technology and artistry was seamless, as natural as walking.
Your people's entire culture revolves around this environment?
Zrixtal asked, watching a performer leap from one level to another with practiced ease. More like the environment revolves around us, Jack replied. The first vertical cities were utilitarian, just boxes stacked on boxes. But people need more than shelter. We need beauty, community, connection to nature. So we learned to build that in from the start. They moved through a series of community spaces where people gathered in groups of varying sizes. Some areas were intimate, designed for small gatherings. Others opened into vast chambers where hundreds could interact across multiple levels. Each zone is like a small town, Jack continued, leading them past a market where vendors called out from shops built into the walls. People know their neighbors, have their favorite spots, and build communities. The architecture just gives them more ways to connect. A group of children raced past on what looked like personal grab sleds, expertly navigating between levels. Their laughter echoed through the space as they chased each other in 3 dimensions. Those children show no fear of heights, Venna observed. Why would they? Jack smiled. We were born to this. Vertical space is as natural to us as horizontal space was to our ancestors. Though we did have to redesign playground equipment about a dozen times before we got it right. They entered a vast indoor park that stretched through several levels. Trees grew at odd angles, their branches reaching between floors. Water flowed in carefully engineered streams, creating a natural atmosphere despite the artificial setting. This is one of our preservation zones, Jack explained. We maintain examples of Earth's original ecology throughout the city. Helps people stay connected to their roots, even as we build toward the future.
The resources required to maintain such spaces must be considerable,
Zrixtal noted. Worth every bit, Jack nodded as he appreciated the burble of the artificial brook. Like I said before, people need green spaces, need to feel connected to something beyond the built environment. Preservation zones also serve as research laboratories, which helps us maintain our understanding of natural systems. We won't forget our roots. They passed through an education center where students gathered in mixed-age groups, learning through a combination of direct instruction and hands-on projects. The classroom spaces flowed between levels, allowing different subjects to interact naturally. Our education system too, Jack said. In an environment like this, you need to know how several things work across a variety of subjects. Everything is integrated. Engineering with art, biology with architecture, social studies with infrastructure management. Only by understanding how it all works together can you, too, work with it all. A group of students worked on what appeared to be a miniature version of the city's environmental systems, adjusting parameters and watching the results play out in real time. Their casual understanding of complex systems spoke to generations of knowledge. Each generation builds on what came before, Jack explained as they watched. The children learn not just how things work, but how to make them work better. Innovation isn't just encouraged, it's necessary for survival at this scale. They moved through residential areas where homes were arranged in interlocking patterns, each unit designed to maximize both privacy and community connection. Gardens and common spaces wound between private dwellings, creating natural gathering places. Another challenge was psychological, Jack said. Humans evolved to live on open ground, under open sky. We had to learn new ways of thinking about space, about community, about what it means to be human in a vertical world. I hinted at this before, but the basic principle is adaptive infrastructure, the engineering chief explained, bringing up a holographic model of the city's core systems. Every component can be upgraded or replaced without disrupting the whole. Architect Venna studied the display with intense focus, her stone-like fingers moving through the hologram to examine specific systems.
The patterns are unlike anything I've seen. How do you prevent cascade failures?
Redundancy and isolation,
Another engineer replied.
Critical systems have multiple backups, and each section can operate independently if needed. But the key is preventative maintenance. The infrastructure is designed to show signs of stress before it turns to real damage. And even then, we still have routine inspections by both human eyes and maintenance drones.
The technical briefing had been going for hours, yet Venna showed no signs of fatigue. She had filled multiple data tablets with notes and diagrams, each revelation leading to new questions.
Your materials engineering must be extraordinary,
She said, examining a nearby support pillar.
The sheer weight this one pillar must bear.
We had to develop new composites, the chief nodded. Traditional materials couldn't handle the structural demands. Each component is engineered at the molecular level for its specific function, and even then we utilize strong permanent magnets to help redistribute load across a wider area. Zrixtal watched the exchange with growing understanding of just how thoroughly he had underestimated human capabilities. Even Venna, renowned among the Talari for her engineering expertise, seemed overwhelmed by the scale and sophistication of Earth's infrastructure. The vast majority of our workforce are individuals responsible for managing the local systems in the area they live in. Nearly half of every community is dedicated simply to keeping that community intact, the chief continued, shifting the display to show logistics networks.
How do you train enough people to manage such complexity?
Venna asked.
Education starts early, one of the human engineers replied. Children learn basic systems theory alongside traditional subjects. By the time they specialize, they understand how everything connects.
The display shifted again, showing layers of automated systems that kept the city functioning. Robots of varying sizes moved through maintenance tunnels, monitoring and repairing infrastructure. Data streams flowed between control centers, coordinating millions of simultaneous operations. Uriah, who had been quietly observing, spoke up.
The Council was right about one thing. Our failure to establish permanent colonies in our solar system was a significant oversight. Now that we have FTL capability, we can finally address that.
Zrixtal turned to her.
What prevented you before?
Communication latency,
she replied, her tone carefully neutral.
Even with our most advanced transmission systems, it could take several minutes for even a single data packet to send. Most secure TCP protocols could take half an hour or longer to establish even once. Real-time coordination between Earth and any permanent colony would have been impossible.
Surely autonomous systems could have managed,
Venna asked. They could handle maintenance and basic operations, the chief agreed. But coordinating development requires constant communication, resources, logistics, administrative decisions. The delays would have created significant complications, not to mention all the competing...
But,
Uriah interjected with an outstretched arm,
FTL solves those issues. We can finally expand without compromising our operational standards.
Venna nodded slowly, understanding.
Your infrastructure does require intense precision.
The briefing concluded with an examination of Earth's current development projects. Each new addition to the city's systems demonstrated the constant evolution of human engineering.
I must admit,
Venna said as they prepared to leave,
I did not expect such sophistication from a single planet species. I do not believe my own people could produce anything like this, even a century from now.
Sometimes,
Uriah replied with the faintest hint of irony,
limitations have unexpected benefits.
Zrixtal reviewed the latest diplomatic reports in his embassy office, each document demanding more of his attention than the last. The requests for meetings alone would fill months. Every council species suddenly wanted to establish a presence on Earth, their earlier mockery forgotten in the rush for access. A message from Representative Kexnar caught his attention. Your initial assessment of the humans requires clarification. The council chambers are in an uproar over reports of their achievements. Please advise on appropriate diplomatic response.
Before he could begin composing a reply, his communication system chimed.
Ambassador, Officer Verone is here regarding the additional embassy requests. Send her in.
He closed the message, gathering his thoughts. Uriah entered with her usual measured stride, carrying a datapad.
I trust you're settling in well?
She asked, taking a seat across from him.
The facilities exceed all expectations,
He replied carefully.
though I find myself increasingly occupied with requests from other council species.
Yes, we've received quite a few applications for embassy offices.
She activated her pad, bringing up a list.
32 new requests just this morning, on top of the 47 whose ambassadors arrived before you. Also including several from species that originally opposed establishing diplomatic relations.
Zrixtal's patches pulsed slightly faster.
How many can you accommodate?
That depends on their requirements. We have space set aside for expansion, but some species have extensive demands in light of my people's achievements.
She scrolled through the list.
The Nexari want an embassy larger than their capital building. The Praxi requested an entire district.
And you can provide such facilities?
Of course.
Her tone remained professional, but he detected a hint of amusement.
Though they may need to adjust their expectations, we don't want to be giving undue preferential treatment.
A notification appeared on his desk display. Another message from the council, this one marked urgent.
The political implications of your achievements are causing considerable concern,
He said, studying her reaction.
Concern?
She raised an eyebrow slightly.
About what exactly?
Many species built their influence on having multiple colony worlds. The revelation that a single planet can support such extensive development, it challenges certain assumptions about expansion and progress.
Ah,
She nodded.
you're worried we've upset your status quo?
The Council is worried.
He corrected.
I find myself more concerned with correcting my own misconceptions. I have already drafted a formal apology for my colleagues' condescension during first contact.
That's unnecessary,
She replied.
We expected condescension of some manner, though it being over our one planet was a bit amusing.
Another chimed from his communication system.
Ambassador, priority message from the Talari High Council. They're requesting immediate consultation regarding human engineering techniques.
Uriah smiled slightly.
Architect Vena's preliminary report must have reached them.
She spent 6 hours transmitting data last night,
Zrixtal confirmed.
I've never seen her so animated about anything.
The Talari at least understand the scale of what we've accomplished.
She gestured to the window, where maintenance crews worked on a nearby building's surface.
Though I expect they'll struggle with our approach.
More notifications appeared on his display. Diplomatic requests, technical inquiries, proposed trade agreements. The subtle ripples of humanity's revelation were rapidly becoming waves.
How do you intend to handle the increased attention?
He asked.
The same way we handle everything else,
She replied.
by building capacity to match demand, and then some. We anticipated significant diplomatic interest once the truth about Earth became known.
Zrixtal studied her carefully.
You knew how we would react. This entire sequence of events, from the Council's mockery to the rush for diplomatic relations, you predicted it all.
We understood that our development path was unusual by galactic standards, once we'd read the initial reports about the spread and numbers of the other Empire's colonies.
She stood, gathering her pad.
The only question was how quickly the wider community would recognize it.
Another priority message appeared, this one from his own government. They wanted him to negotiate technology exchange agreements immediately, before other species secured favorable terms.
I need to prepare responses to these inquiries, he said, gesturing to his display. The Council will expect a full report.
Of course.
She moved toward the door, then paused.
Oh, and Ambassador, you might want to mention that we're already discussing joint development projects with several species, just to provide context for their decisions.
Zrixtal sat in his embassy office as he composed his final report to the Council. The first draft had been too clinical, the second too effusive. Finding the right words to convey humanity's achievements without seeming to pander or exaggerate proves challenging. He studied the city through his window, watching the endless flows of traffic between levels. Even after weeks of observation, he kept noticing new details. The way a drone cleaned a window before it became too dirty, how a handful of shops in a nearby park actually changed ownership throughout the day, a coffee shop in the morning, then a diner at night, how the rolling clouds of water vapor, all part of an artificially maintained water cycle, never quite billowed into traffic lanes, only over or under them. His communication system chimed.
Ambassador, Architect Venna requests a moment of your time. Send her in.
He saved his draft, turning as the Talari engineer entered. She looked different than when they'd first arrived, more animated, despite her stone-like features.
I'm submitting my technical evaluation to the High Council,
she said without preamble.
I thought you should see it first.
That's considerate of you.
He accepted the offered data crystal.
Though I'm not qualified to assess engineering details.
The details aren't important, she replied. What matters is the fundamental shift in perspective they represent. My people have always approached construction as a process of imposing order on nature, on building despite the environment. But humanity, they've taken every aspect of the natural order and modified it, replicated it as needed. They didn't need to make new tools for artificial atmospherics or tectonic stabilization when nature could do it better.
Zrixtal nodded slowly.
I've noticed similar patterns in their administrative approach. Every system seems designed to evolve over time as needs change.
Exactly.
She gestured to the window.
Look at their population density. Most species would have built rigid infrastructure, tried to minimize how much space each person needs, which is why our most populous cities were always cramped. But humanity built everything on the concept of shared space. By giving away the spaces they use when they don't need them, they essentially created more space for everyone.
He turned back to his report, adding new observations. The Council needed to understand not just what humanity had achieved, but how they thought about achievement itself.
Will your people adopt their methods?
He asked.
Some of them, though it will take time to adjust.
She moved toward the door, then paused.
You know what impressed me most? Not the engineering, but the willingness to admit flaws. Every system here is designed to be replaced by something better. Every technical specification came with estimates about just how off it was from the ideal.
After she left, Zrixtal reviewed his report one final time. The words felt inadequate to capture what he'd learned, but they would have to suffice.
Humanity's development of Earth represents more than engineering achievement. It demonstrates an approach to civilization that challenges our fundamental assumptions about progress and community. While we spread across stars seeking new worlds to claim, they focused on understanding how to live well on the world they had. Their vertical cities are not merely efficient uses of space, they are living experiments in community. The Council's initial dismissal of humanity as a single-planet species revealed our own limited perspective. We measured their progress by our standards, failing to recognize that they had chosen a different path. Their achievement is not simply in the scale of their construction, but in creating infrastructure that grows and evolves with them. I recommend immediate approval of all pending technology exchange agreements, with the understanding that we have as much to learn from humanity's methods as we do their machines. Their vertical cities demonstrate possibilities we never considered, approaches we never attempted. Most importantly, I suggest we reconsider how we measure species development. Humanity proves that mastering one world can represent greater achievement than claiming many. Their experience offers lessons that could benefit all Council species, particularly as we face growing resource constraints in our existing colonies. The humans have already begun sharing their techniques with several Council species. Early results suggest their methods can be adapted for various environments and cultures. This technological exchange may reshape how we approach planetary development across the galaxy.
He transmitted the report, then turned back to watch the city. A maintenance crew was modifying a transport tube, smoothly rerouting traffic while they worked. The changes would be complete before most residents noticed anything had shifted. Adaptation without disruption, growth without conquest, progress measured not in territory claimed, but in understanding gained. He himself was beginning to understand why humanity had seemed so calm in the face of the Council's mockery. They hadn't been defensive because they had nothing to prove. They simply knew their own worth.